The 1872 census listed the Sewell estate with perfect clarity. 43 acres of arable land, 16 of forest, 24 heads of cattle, 11 indentured workers, and a main house with 15 rooms. It recorded the inventory down to every teaspoon, every oil lamp, every window with panes uncracked. It named every servant from the stable hand to the cook. But nowhere, not once, was the name Lionel Sewell written. He was 9 that year, blond, thin, narrow in the shoulders but unblinking in the eyes. And yet he did not exist in the world of law, ink, or signature. He was a presence felt more than seen, always in the corner of a hallway or the flicker at the end of a candle's glow. The staff said little. Those who remained did not question what was left off the books. Those who asked questions did not remain. Judge Horatio Sewell was known for his precision, the kind of man who corrected ledgers by candlelight, who combed his son's hair with surgical force, who considered silence not absence, but efficiency. His wife had died in childbirth. That detail was recorded. The death certificate said complications of the womb, but the midwife had scribbled something else in the margins. His hands touched the cord before mine. The note was crossed out before filing. The judge mourned with his jaw clenched, then built a wall between himself and the nursery. He told the staff that Lionel was not to be disturbed during daylight hours, and the child soon came to understand that affection was not part of survival. He moved without sound, responded without being called, learned to speak only when certain it would not bring punishment. Most boys that age ran through fields, scraped knees on fence posts, shouted across rivers. But Lionel was not allowed sunlight. His window faced inward, into a courtyard walled on all 4 sides, a space used for laundry lines and composting. His world was dim, airless, watched from every angle. He was tutored by itinerant teachers, men who stayed only a season, their contracts bound in ink and silence. One, a Mr. Holcomb, left a journal under a loose floorboard, found years later by a restoration crew. In it he wrote of a lesson interrupted by the boy's sudden collapse, mouth foaming slightly, skin cold to the touch, and a second later, upright again as though nothing had happened. He mentioned the eyes last. He didn't blink, the entry read. And when I asked the date, he answered in Latin. By then, Judge Sewell had developed a reputation among nearby counties. He was the kind of man whose verdicts came quickly, whose punishments were described as more instructional than punitive. No one was surprised when the estate was granted partial exemption from census scrutiny. Too many government contacts, too many handshakes at courthouse steps. When an agent did come once unannounced in spring of '73, he was turned away at the gate. The report he filed later said, "House appeared, empty, windows dark, smelled faintly of oil and iron. No child visible. He died 3 weeks later, reportedly from a fall." The coroner wrote, "Broken neck, though the neck was found still attached, bent at an angle, considered unnatural even in death." There were rumors, of course. Children claimed to see a figure watching them from the fields at dusk. Some described him with animal bones tied around his neck, others with feathers woven into his hair. He was neither boy nor man, they said, too still to be one, too small to be the other. One child, a girl named Elsie, said she saw the figure standing by her family's well one morning. When she told her father, he went out with a lantern and found small barefoot prints in the frost. But what disturbed him more were the marks carved into the wood, not letters but symbols, mirrored loops, upside-down crescents, lines that curved back into themselves. Elsie died the following winter of internal rupture. The family moved soon after. In official documents, Lionel Sewell never appears. No birth certificate, no baptism, no school record. And in later documents, when the estate is passed, when ownership changes hands, He is only referred to in one odd phrase written in the judge's own hand: the heir without census. The ink had not faded. It was written with intent, with knowledge that there are children who live in houses where laws cannot see them. Children whose suffering must be hidden not through chains but through paperwork, omissions, and a father's precision. And so the boy was not on paper, but he was there, watching, listening, learning, preparing for the methods that would not be passed down by blood but by silence. The door to the root cellar was not part of the official house plans. It had no hinges on the outside, no visible handle, and no latch within reach of any ordinary man. It was concealed behind an aging wall of preserved shelves and crooked hooks where dry herbs hung like brittle fingers. Most of the staff did not know it was there. The few who did had either left the estate quietly or never left at all. And yet in the spring of 1874, a traveling midwife named Agnes Merriweather was summoned in haste to the Sewell estate with the promise of payment in silver. She was told there was a complication with a housemaid, a pregnancy never spoken of, and a delivery that required absolute discretion. When she arrived, the girl in question was pale and already cold, her mouth packed with cotton. Judge Sewell dismissed the death with a wave of his hand and instead gestured toward the cellar. "It was the boy," he said. The boy had been coughing through the night, whispering in languages they didn't recognize. He needed to be moved. Agnes was no stranger to loss. She had seen stillbirths on dirt floors, women bled out in fields, and infants too malformed to cry. But what waited behind the hidden door was not illness. It was construction. The stone walls of the cellar dropped into a colder chamber lined with brick and sealed shut by iron bolts driven into the corners. There were no shelves for potatoes or racks for canned fruit. Instead, in the very center of the floor, illuminated by a single swinging oil lantern, sat a cradle carved from pale birch, its surface lacquered to a dull sheen, the wood warped slightly from moisture or heat. Agnes stepped forward and saw that the cradle had no bedding, no pillow, no quilt, only an interior of dried leather stitched into place with thread so fine it could have come from a surgeon's needle. The bottom was stained dark, the color of dried blood or aged varnish, with streaks that dragged toward the head of the cradle and stopped. Something had been tied there, something that struggled. The judge watched her closely. He said nothing, only studied her face as she examined the object. Then he asked if she had ever heard of sleep training rituals from the northern tribes, where children were conditioned to withstand cold and noise by being kept awake for days in hollowed-out wood structures. Agnes said no. He asked if she believed in the power of silence. That silence, if nurtured early enough, could erase the soul's tendency to scream. He asked if she had ever held a newborn who didn't blink. She didn't answer. She left that night, but not before seeing Lionel standing just outside the cellar door, one hand pressed flat against the stone, his eyes wide open in a stare that did not seem childlike, only observant. He said nothing. His hands were clean, but there were flecks of something dark under his nails. Agnes walked 30 miles home. She never told anyone what she saw except for a priest in her final year. According to the record of that confession, written only in fragmented notes, she described the cradle as not made for comfort, but for shaping. She said the judge believed sound created weakness in children, that the cradle's deep wood and stitched leather absorbed screams before they could echo. She described hearing no noise in that room, not even her own footsteps, as if the floor swallowed sound like a throat. She said the boy had been taught to breathe only when allowed, and that when she looked into the basin of the cradle, she saw fingernail scratches at the headboard and a word burned into the wood in Latin, sileo. I am silent. Years later, during renovations, the basement was sealed off. A wall was built over the entrance, and no further mention of the cellar was made in family records. But workmen described a sour smell that never went away, a coldness in that corner of the house that defied fire. Some claimed to hear creaking like rocking wood late at night. No one stayed past sundown. One laborer said he saw a cradle through a crack in the mortar, still upright, still clean, though no one had touched it in decades. And those who remembered Agnes Merriweather said she was never quite the same. She began to go silent for hours at a time, even while tending to mothers in labor. She refused to assist with male births, and in her final days she carved something into the underside of her own bed frame. When her niece found it, she showed it to the parish priest. A single word over and over, etched with a nail. Not help, not God. Just the same word Lionel had been trained to carry in his chest from the cradle onward. Sileo. Silence. His first language, his inheritance. The Sewell estate maintained meticulous furnace logs, hour by hour, coal weight measured to the ounce, heat notes etched in fine cursive along the margins. In January of 1876, the logs recorded a burn that lasted 3 nights without pause, hotter than any previous entry. The handwriting changed midway through, as if one hand had gone missing and another, shakier one took over. Yet no official fire was reported, no structure damaged, no chimney blackened. Only the basement seemed touched by heat, and only in the record books. Upstairs, the house remained silent, rooms untouched by ash, drapes unruffled. The estate's 3 black caretakers, Thomas, Elsie, and Rufus, were never seen again after that week. Their names vanished from the payroll, their belongings cleared from the servants' quarters by morning. No burial, no farewell. When asked, the judge's answer was always the same. They broke contract. No further explanation was offered. Thomas was the groundsman, strong hands, quiet mouth. He kept to himself but had the habit of tracing crosses with his thumb on fence posts as he passed. He'd once pulled Lionel out of a flooded ditch during a storm, lifting the boy with one arm like a sack of flour. The boy said nothing then. He just stared. Days later, Thomas found the same ditch filled with stagnant water again, despite the dry weather. A carved wooden bell floated on top, weighted with what looked like a clump of hair tied in thread. He burned it. 2 nights later, he woke to the sound of the furnace roaring when it shouldn't have been lit at all. He went down to check it. No one saw him after that. Elsie handled the linens. She was quick, older, and carried the smell of camphor everywhere she went. She had cleaned the room where the birch cradle had once sat and told others to keep their voices low in that part of the house. She whispered to the walls sometimes. She said she heard humming. Not human, not machine, but something low and hollow, like a pipe vibrating just under the floor. She told the cook once that the air in the root cellar didn't move like it should, that it pressed against your skin, that when you lit a match, the flame bent sideways even with no breeze. She wrote a letter to her sister saying she was thinking of leaving. That letter was returned unopened, stamped "No Known Residence." The ink on the envelope had smudged with moisture, though the week had been dry. Rufus worked the night furnace. He managed the coal supply, kept the embers controlled. His ledger, entries were always neat, cautious. But the last entry in his hand, dated 2 days before they vanished, was different. The numbers were precise, but the comment column had only one word: breathing. Below that, the ink bled across the page as if the pen had paused too long or the hand had trembled. His boots were found at the base of the stairs leading to the lower chamber. One was charred along the heel. The rest of him was never found. After their disappearance, the judge made no statement. He hired no replacements. He simply locked the basement stairwell and marked the furnace room under repair. Yet the logs continued, written now in Lionel's tidy, deliberate script. The temperature readings dropped to ordinary levels, but the comments became stranger. Phrases like "sound held steady," or "ashes moved again," or "quiet sustained for 3 hours." The furnace burned, but no one delivered coal. No smoke ever left the chimney. And the cellar stayed warm even when the rest of the house froze over in winter. Neighbors who dared visit said the estate smelled strange. Burned leather, wet wool, and something else under it, like singed hair and boiled milk. The judge said the furnace had to be maintained for structural reasons, that moisture had been damaging the lower beams, that the heat prevented decay. He said this calmly, without blinking, as Lionel stood nearby with a smudge of soot across his collar and a burn mark at the edge of his cuff, as if he'd reached somewhere too close to flame. When one of the judge's former clerks came to investigate, drawn by unpaid wages and rumors, he noticed a new iron chute installed behind the furnace. He followed its path with his hand along the wall, traced it down toward the ground. When he knocked, he said it echoed not like brick, but like bone. He left that night without collecting his pay. Years later, he described the sound in a letter to a friend, saying it was like ashes shifting themselves. No grave ever bore the names of Thomas, Elsie, or Rufus, but a seamstress passing through the county once claimed to see 3 figures standing in the Sewell garden at night, heads bowed, hands blackened, motionless. She thought they were statues until one turned to look at her. She never returned. And still the furnace burned, quiet, steady, never fed, never cold. It appeared only once in the records, buried beneath timber invoices and limestone hauling costs. Interior chamber, octagonal, padded, reinforced, no aperture required. The notation was written in blue chalk pencil, unusual for the time, and signed only with an initial that didn't match any known contractor. The construction foreman who worked on the 1877 Sewell estate expansion later admitted to drinking himself near blind that year. He said something about being paid to forget what he built, and by the time he did speak of it, his tongue had turned to mush and his memory to pulp. But the blueprint was found, brittle and water-stained, with faint measurements drawn over what looked like an inner room not meant for living, storage, or protection. It had no doorway on the original print, just a blank, windowless chamber nested inside the walls like a second heart made of brick and silence. The room itself was discovered decades later during restoration efforts after the estate had long been abandoned. It was hidden behind what seemed like a solid stone wall in the eastern wing. But under the paint, under the plaster, there was a seam. A narrow gap that revealed not a passage but a pivot. The wall turned inward soundlessly, revealing a narrow hall no wider than a coffin's length. At the end of it stood a door made not of wood or iron, but layers of compressed horsehair, felt, and linen soaked in something oily that left a bitter taste in the throat just standing near it. The hinges were internal. There was no handle. It opened only when pushed in a pattern, pressure points that matched the palm width of a child. Inside was heat, still and old. The air had long since gone stale, but not from decay. From insulation. The walls were octagonal, as the notes had claimed, but every surface curved ever so slightly, rounding off any edge where 2 walls might meet. There were no corners, no place for a shadow to settle. And every wall was lined in a fabric that looked like wool but absorbed all sound. It felt thick but somehow damp. Beneath it, layers of something denser pulsed faintly when touched, as though stitched into the wall was not just padding but some system of breathing. There was no furniture, no cot, no lamp, no basin. Only a thin line etched into the floor, a ring no wider than a man's stride, perfectly circular, blackened with heat, and something that shimmered like dried glue. In the center of that ring, A rusted collar lay anchored to the floor by a spiral bolt. It was small, child-sized, padded with cracked leather, but the padding was uneven, as if something inside had moved many times. Near it lay a bowl, ceramic painted with floral patterns on the outside and scratches on the inside, claw marks or bite patterns etched into the glaze. They found a piece of linen nearby, folded into a tight square, stained dark and stiff at the edges, with a single letter stitched at the corner, an L. No one had recorded the room's use. There were no family journals that spoke of discipline or confinement. But in a private letter sent by Judge Sewell to a northern colleague in the winter of 1878, one cryptic phrase appeared. The boy requires correction beyond architecture. The mind resists linearity. Corners teach escape. The letter was signed in full. What he meant by corners remained open to speculation, but historians who studied the floor plan of the estate noted how the entire wing had been subtly reshaped to surround that room. Doorways shifted, closets narrowed, walls reinforced. It was as though the house had been taught to protect the room's shape. And Lionel, now 11 by that year, had stopped being seen during daylight hours altogether. One laborer later claimed to hear humming from the sealed walls, though no electricity ever ran through the chamber. Another said the woolen padding grew warm to the touch at night and felt colder than stone in the morning. When they drilled one of the panels, a burst of foul air escaped, and with it came the faintest sound, something between a sigh and a wheeze. They patched the hole and left the room sealed again. Too many of the crew grew sick that week. One coughed up blood with no illness. Another began stuttering after 20 years of clean speech. Nothing inside that room had edges, but the boy who stayed there did. He learned early that pain traveled in straight lines, that corners gave the mind a place to retreat. In the octagon there were no hiding spots, there was no comfort in geometry. Only soundless nights, a bowl that was always full, and a father who believed shape could change the soul. The collar rusted, but the floor beneath it was smooth from wear. Someone had walked that circle over and over. Someone had been kept in place by design, by silence, by walls that curved just enough to keep screams from bouncing back. Between 1890 and 1910, under a program designed to relieve crowded city orphanages, the federal government relocated thousands of children across rural America. The Sewell estate, by then nearly 40 years into its quiet decay, was quietly approved as a receiving site. A single stamp on a government form opened the gate. Records from the Bureau of Orphan Indenture list dozens of children sent to the Sewell grounds. Most were under 11. Most were marked unclaimed. Many arrived from Baltimore, a few from as far as Philadelphia. The paperwork showed intake, signatures, train routes, but there is no documentation beyond that point. No census reappearances, no transfers, no graves, no names resurfacing in any town registry. It was as if the children were absorbed by the land itself. The estate ledger during that 20-year span shows only slight increases in food deliveries. A few extra bushels of corn, an added barrel of oats, but no rise in clothing orders, no schoolbook shipments, no increase in medical purchases. Receipts for shoes stop altogether after 1892. The staff list shrinks, but the furnace logs expand. More frequent burns, higher temperatures, ash tallies that no longer matched the fuel supply. By 1895, Lionel was in full control of the estate's internal operations. The judge had grown reclusive, thin, shadowed. He no longer appeared at town meetings. He signed documents in uneven script. Some say he had gone blind. Others say he had simply turned inward, speaking only to the boy who never left. The children arrived in wagons, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs. Local accounts speak of hearing crying near the road leading to the back gate. One merchant claimed he sold water to a girl with blistered hands who wore a wool dress in the middle of July. He said her teeth were small and worn down. When he asked her name, she gave only a number. He watched her be taken away by a pale man with a limp. That girl never returned. When the merchant tried to report it, he was told the Sewell estate was a federally approved site and that relocation cases were sealed to prevent shame for future adoptions. But there were no adoptions. There were no names matched with families. A field inspector who visited in 1898 reported no visible children on the property. He noted in his journal that the main house smelled of chalk, lye, and something sweet that made his nose bleed. He stayed only 1 hour. That inspector was later reassigned without explanation. When questioned in retirement, he said he had seen shoes in the attic, small, left in rows. All the left shoes were missing. He said he found a ledger where a child's name had been replaced with a symbol. He refused to say what the symbol was. A boy named Isaac Dunn was listed as sent to the Sewell estate in 1903. His intake form noted a stutter and extreme light sensitivity. His mother had died in a factory fire. He was described as gentle, sensitive. His file ends with the words, "Received, no further action." Years later, his younger sister, who had been placed with another family, tried to locate him. She found no record, not in the county clerk's office, not in the church registry. She wrote letters, all returned unopened. Eventually, she found a map of the estate and took a train as close as she could get. She arrived in town with a photo of Isaac asking questions. Locals told her to leave it alone. One man took her aside and said, "If he was sent there, he's part of the walls now." She left that same day. Her return ticket was never used. One field report filed under seal and marked "not for release" described a structure on the far end of the estate, detached from the main house and unlisted in any blueprint. It had no doors, only slats wide enough for wind and sound. Inside, piles of what looked like cloth bundles lay against the walls, arranged in circles. The report said they were warm to the touch, though the building itself was cold. A low sound like humming was heard even when no wind passed through. The inspector refused to return the next day. He burned his notes. But fragments of the report remained, enough to prove presence, enough to prove the government knew. The program was shut down quietly in 1911. No inquiry was made into the Sewell site, no charges, no graves exhumed. When the estate was audited 10 years later, no children's belongings remained. Not a doll, not a book, not a trace of noise. But the floors upstairs had been sanded so thin they dipped in the middle as if small feet had circled the same roots night after night, wearing down the wood like water. Those feet never left prints, only absence, only a silence so total it carried the weight of names never spoken again. The ledgers were hidden beneath floorboards in the East Wing library, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with twine. They were not diaries, not scientific journals, not personal reflections. They were logs, clinical, precise, and free of emotion. Each entry followed the same format: subject identifier, time of placement, observed behavior, and duration of procedure. At the top of every page, written in faded ink with chilling neatness, was the same heading: BGB Protocol, Silence Through Method. The initials stood for Birch Glass Bell, though the word bell seemed misleading. There was no ringing in what followed, only stillness. The device was described in fragments across different entries. It was a dome, hand-blown from thick glass and reinforced at the base with a collar of dark brass. The interior surface had once been etched with fine symbols, but repeated washings wore them down. It was large enough to cover a child's head and shoulders. A rubber seal lined the bottom to ensure vacuum hold. Once placed, a crank mechanism drew out air slowly while the subject was instructed to remain completely motionless. Any movement triggered greater suction. The goal was not pain, but compliance through dread. It was not about screams. It was about removing the very possibility of making one. The term silence calibration appeared often. In one entry, a boy was placed under the bell for 3 minutes after speaking out of turn. His breathing was recorded in intervals. 42 seconds, then 31, then 20. The final note read, "Subject reached compliance, receptive to no sound cueing." Another record referred to obedience through breathlessness and described a girl who panicked after 1 minute. Her arms were tied to prevent flailing. The bell fogged from the inside. No record showed what happened after, only that the entry ended with the phrase written on every page. No mark, no memory. What made the technique so disturbing was its quiet design. It left no bruises, no cuts, no visible trauma. Yet the effects lingered. Later census reports noted that children who had been relocated to nearby towns after the estate's partial closure exhibited strange behaviors. Long silences, difficulty breathing when alone, aversion to glass jars, and in some cases unconscious flinching at the sound of vacuum pumps. One girl, adopted by a couple in Roanoke, was said to scream only when someone opened a window too quickly. Another, taken in by a teacher in Culpeper, would not speak until her face was covered with a dish towel. Inside the logs, certain names were circled. These were not children brought in by the orphan program. They were staff, a tutor, a cook's assistant, a groundskeeper's nephew, all recorded as having undergone adjustment after failing to maintain silence protocols. The bell was not just a method, it was a test. It separated those who could endure the void from those who cracked inside it. The notes praised children who made no noise even under oxygen strain. One was referred to as the ideal vessel. The handwriting in that entry matched Lionel's from earlier documents. Sharp, slanted, meticulous. A separate page, torn and folded, contained only a diagram. No words, no description, just the bell rendered in charcoal sketch. A child sat beneath it, knees tucked, back straight, face turned up in reverence. Around the base were small symbols that repeated in patterns, loops inside loops. Above the drawing, one phrase had been added in thin graphite. No voice, no sin. There were no surviving examples of the device. No pieces recovered, no blueprints registered with local glassmakers. But in the floor beneath the study where the ledgers had been hidden, there were faint rings scorched into the wood, perfect circles about the width of a human neck and shoulders. One ring was darker than the others, not blackened by fire, but discolored from breath that went nowhere. In silence it had taught. In silence it had punished, not through pain, not through blood, but through the unbearable echo of needing to breathe and being told not to. March of 1907 should have been remembered for its death toll. The typhoid outbreak that spread across neighboring counties claimed dozens, from infants to the elderly, taking entire families before they had time to name the sickness out loud. The fever moved fast, the water was fouled, and the doctors were slow. In every surrounding township, black wreaths hung on doors and pine boxes lined the roads. But in the county where the Sewell estate sat, not a single death was recorded for the entire month. No funerals, no burials, no tolling of church bells. The records show perfect, uninterrupted life. An impossible silence stretched across 31 days of documented grief elsewhere. The explanation, when one finally came, was given in a short statement from the county coroner's office. Deceased individuals in cases of typhoid confirmed by symptoms were to be delivered directly to the Sewell estate under a temporary arrangement with a federal research directive. The statement cited an experimental study, unnamed and unsigned, allegedly designed to improve rural response protocols. Families who asked where their loved ones had gone were told the bodies were helping science. Some were told the coffins would be returned sealed with no viewings permitted. Others received no word at all. There were no press notices, no medical journals published. The judge had long been dead by then, but Lionel remained. And Lionel had learned how to file paperwork that vanished after submission. The wagons came at night, wheels wrapped in cloth to dull the sound. Witnesses claimed they saw stretchers covered in oilcloth, unloaded behind the eastern gate near the storage barn. But the barn had not been used for storage in years. Sheriff's deputy who broke rank and followed a wagon without approval said he saw something that made his hands shake for days. He told his wife he saw a large wooden box on a pulley, lowered underground. He said he heard movement from inside, something that thumped once and then stopped. He was relieved from duty 3 days later. His official file lists a nervous condition. He never worked again. Inside the Sewell estate, the furnace logs for March show uninterrupted burns day and night with no entries for coal delivery. Yet the heat held steady and the ash weight quadrupled. A line item from Lionel's private account shows a one-time purchase of surgical shears, quantities unspecified. A delivery invoice confirms large orders of powdered lime, rubber gloves, and a substance labeled only as organic stabilizer, with no known manufacturer listed. What happened inside the estate remains speculative. Some believe the bodies were dissected, studied, dissolved. Others claim Lionel was trying to stop death to extract its pattern or reverse it. But those who knew him, what little there were, said he did not fear death. He feared interruption. He feared the sound a body made when it left the world without permission. It wasn't the silence he loved. It was the way silence filled a room after breath was stolen out. By April, the outbreak faded. The county returned to its routine. A single grave marker was placed on Sewell land that spring. It bore no name, only a date, March 1907. No one claimed responsibility for it. No one ever confessed. But soil tests conducted years later revealed something strange in the eastern fields. High concentrations of human calcium and potassium levels beneath the wildflowers. Bones, shattered and boiled, pressed flat by decades of quiet. It was called the Deathless Month because the paper said so. Because the books were balanced and the bodies were delivered off page. But silence does not mean survival. And the ground, even when undisturbed, still remembers what it was asked to hold. The blueprint was never meant to be found. It was folded into the back of a church hymnal stored in a broken crate beneath the collapsed chapel wing, sealed behind dust and scripture. The drawing was fragile, its ink faded by time and oil, but the design was clear. It showed a network of pipes thin as wrists, stretching like veins beneath the floorboards of the Sewell estate. Each hallway, each chamber, even the root cellar. The pipes ran through them all. There were no labels, no scale, only arrows indicating direction and a single phrase scrawled at the top in careful script. Respiratory arrangement. Choir Model B. At the bottom, in the same hand, 3 words were written smaller, almost as if whispered onto the paper. They sing still. At first glance, it resembled a rudimentary heating system, perhaps for air movement or warmth. But those who examined it closely noticed something strange. The lengths of pipe didn't align with chimney flues or fire grates. They twisted in loops, rose into walls, coiled beneath bedrooms, and in one section ended in a sealed chamber that had no entrance or floor above it. Each terminus was fitted with a narrowing, a mouth of sorts, and several had branching forks like split tongues. No one could explain their purpose until a researcher blew air into one of the recovered tubes. The sound that came out was not a whistle. It was not music. It was a breath. Not one from lungs, but the long, low exhale of something mimicking life. According to Lionel's recovered journals, this system was installed in 1905 and completed in secret by a hired team of masons under the guise of foundation repair. Most of them didn't return. One reportedly severed 2 fingers during construction and refused to explain how. Another disappeared entirely, and his brother claimed he had started dreaming of being buried inside walls. The blueprint made no mention of purpose, but in one of Lionel's later notes, tucked beside a diagram of a child's skull, he wrote, "The choir exists to remind the silence who taught it to sing." The system activated when the wind reached a certain angle against the north-facing windows, and when the heat rose from the basement furnace just enough to lift pressure through the copper stems. The pipes, designed with deliberate imperfections, would catch the current and produce harmonics. But these were not tones of beauty or design. They were ragged, irregular breaths, gasps, exhales, soft humming as if from many mouths pressed into the walls. Witnesses described walking through the estate during these times and feeling as though they were inside a body, each hallway a lung, each room pulsing faintly with sound. During one winter storm, a field nurse staying on the property heard the house begin to breathe as the wind picked up. She wrote in her diary that it sounded like children, but not laughing or crying, just breathing together in slow, rhythmic cadence. She could not sleep. The next morning, she packed her things and left without collecting payment. She left behind her gloves and her Bible. In the weeks after, locals claimed the estate could be heard from over 2 miles away on nights with strong wind. The sounds faint but human, not animal, and layered like a group holding breath at different intervals. Some claimed it was meant as a mourning device, a monument of grief for the children who vanished. Others believed it was a training system, a way to condition the living to match the rhythm of the house. But Lionel's writing was clear. He did not mourn. He calculated, and in one final notation written beneath a charcoal sketch of the pipe system branching out like lungs, he penned a single sentence. No voice survives without practice, and so the house was taught to breathe, not to speak, not to scream, but to breathe in harmony with the quiet things it was made to hold. The drought of 1921 cracked the earth down to its roots. Wells across the county shrank to puddles, and farmers dug deeper with blistered hands, desperate for whatever the ground might still offer. One such well, dry since the turn of the century, sat forgotten at the edge of the Sewell estate. Overgrown with vine and warped timber, it was marked only by a rusted hook and a rope long since cut. When a hired man attempted to clear it for possible use, he found the soil brittle enough to crumble under his boots. The well mouth gave way with little resistance, revealing a shaft dry and hollow. What they found at the bottom was not water. It was bone. The skeleton was curled, small, not yet fused. A child, likely less than 2 years old, its ribs caved inward as if crushed from within. The limbs were arranged with unnatural care, bent not from a fall but placed in position, hands crossed, spine arched. But it was the skull that drew silence from the men who peered down into the shaft. The jaw was wide open, and inside, still intact, sat a bell no larger than a coin, made of unglazed clay. Its surface was rough, handmade, with faint markings pressed into it. Looping lines that didn't form letters, just repeated shapes like mirrored threes. The bell had no clapper. It could not ring. Its bottom was sealed tight with a dark residue that later testing confirmed was human blood, long dried, but still binding. The body was removed under orders from the local sheriff, but no inquiry followed. The remains were not logged into county records. The bell was taken into custody and kept locked in a drawer marked "Unexplained Artifact." One officer who handled it said the object felt warm, even after sitting on a stone windowsill for hours. Another claimed the bell gave off a faint vibration, not sound, but a pressure in the air like ears filling at altitude. When a clerk attempted to open the seal at the base, the clay split in half without force. Inside were fine strands of hair, tightly coiled, and a single baby tooth embedded in resin. The coroner who examined the remains filed an unofficial note in the margin of his personal journal. He wrote that the child's tongue had been removed post-mortem, the jaw dislocated to force the bell inside. The blood at the seal likely came from the child's own mouth, used to bind the object shut. He ended the entry with one question. To silence what? No infant was reported missing in the region during that time. No burial records were amended, and no family came forward to claim the child. But in a box of discarded paperwork from the Sewell property, found decades later beneath rotting floorboards, was a note scribbled on the back of an order slip. It read, "Still too loud, even in death." Bell must go in. The handwriting matched Lionel's earlier ledgers. Historians speculated that the clay bell was part of a larger ritual, something more symbolic than scientific. The shape, the material, the sealing, all suggested intention beyond cruelty. It was not enough to silence the child in life. The silence had to follow into death, bound by blood and bone and hidden underground. Perhaps Lionel believed sound was a contagion, that a cry carried into the afterlife might undo his work. Or perhaps the bell wasn't meant to prevent a sound, but to contain one. In the years that followed, strange occurrences surrounded that same well. Children claimed to hear faint cries beneath the ground during thunderstorms. One boy swore he saw bubbles rising from the soil near its edge, even though the shaft remained dry. A woman passing through said her baby screamed when carried past the spot, then fell instantly quiet once out of sight of the stone ring. She left town the next day. The clay fragments of the bell were eventually lost, the bones too. The official file was marked with a single line. Remains dismissed due to lack of claim. But those who stood at the edge of the well after its discovery swore they felt a pressure in their chest, a tightening like breath held too long, as if the ground itself remembered the last breath forced inward. As if the silence once sealed in a baby's mouth had learned how to echo back. The ledger was stored in a brass-handled trunk beneath a floorboard in the western annex, wrapped in layers of linen and sealed with pitch. It wasn't labeled as school records. The cover bore no emblem, no year, just a torn scrap pinned to the front with a single word scrawled in graphite. Admittance. Inside, in Lionel Sewell's unmistakable script, was a list of boys enrolled in something called the Nocturnal Instructional Cohort. The location was listed simply as Lower Wing. There were no surnames, only first names and numbers. What drew attention most was a column labeled Tooth Count, placed between date of entry and behavioral index. Most rows listed 0. A few had ones. None were above 2. The entries began in 1912 and stopped abruptly in 1919. Each student profile included a notation. Confirmed silent, compatible with module, or requires extraction. It was unclear whether the tooth count referred to loss by accident, malnutrition, or something deliberate. In the margins of one page, a line was added faintly in red ink. Teeth obstruct tonal purity. A note beside it simply said, cracking heard during lesson 3. Another page featured diagrams, not of lesson plans, but of oral cavities, jaw shapes, and gum exposure, paired with tonal frequency numbers. The boys were not being taught to speak. They were being trained to function without speaking at all. What happened in the lower wing remains unclear. The architectural layout of the estate does not include it, but foundation scans decades later revealed a flattened tunnel system with shallow alcoves barely the length of a cot. Metal rings were found embedded in the walls. One photograph showed what looked like bite marks along the wood near these anchors, shallow, incomplete, as if made by mouths that could not grip. The name of the program appeared in no public record. No school board, no ministry, no inspection log ever referenced the nocturnal school. But a private journal by a nurse stationed briefly at the estate in 1915 mentions hearing a rhythmic knocking beneath her floor just past midnight. 3 taps, then silence, repeated until dawn. She believed it was code, some crude language built of pain and obedience. She never found where it came from. The school left no diplomas, no graduates, only a list of names, only gums that bled, and floors that still remember the sound of learning done in total, obedient silence. In the spring of 1932, a man was found wandering the roadside near Ash Ridge, 70 miles from the nearest edge of the Sewell estate. He was barefoot, dressed in clothing too small for his frame, and covered in fine ash that clung to the folds of his skin like dust pressed into pores. A farmer spotted him standing at the edge of a ditch, arms limp at his sides, his eyes squinting against the morning sun as if unfamiliar with it. When questioned, he could not provide a name. He did not run. He did not speak. He only stared ahead, mouth slightly open, as if waiting for a sound that never came. Brought into custody, officers noted something strange before he was even booked. He moved in bursts, short, cautious steps with his heels slightly raised, as though the floor beneath him might give way. His arms hung awkwardly, elbows tight to his ribs, hands clenched not in fear but in some rehearsed stillness. He did not blink often, and when he did, it was slow, deliberate, mechanical. Though clearly in his 20s, his posture mimicked that of a child no older than 9. It wasn't just regression, it was programming. Attempts to fingerprint him failed. His fingertips were smooth, polished like glass, lacking the ridges necessary for identification. Specialists believed they had been removed intentionally, likely through abrasion over time. But beneath the surface, X-rays revealed a stranger truth. His bones showed signs of stunted ossification, as if his skeleton had been conditioned to grow without strength. His femurs bowed slightly, and the vertebrae of his lower spine were compressed, the kind of compression found in children locked in crouched positions for extended periods. A medical note listed the phrase, "incomplete growth suppression, method unknown." He bore no scars, no tattoos, no dental work. But on the back of his neck, hidden beneath hair too neatly trimmed for someone found on the road, was a faint ring of tissue, lighter than the rest of his skin, smooth with what looked like old stitch marks faded into the dermis. One physician believed it to be a healed collar wound. Another compared it to pressure rings found on infants kept in tight harnesses for restraint. When asked to speak, the man opened his mouth but produced no sound. Not even a gasp. It was as if his body had forgotten how to use air. A nurse noted that he breathed silently, each inhale shallow and exact, like someone avoiding detection even in rest. Days passed, and still he did not speak. When left alone, he paced in slow circles, measured, consistent, never once stepping outside a 3-foot radius. Like the floor beneath him still held a bolt. Eventually, he was transferred to a state hospital. His case file was marked unidentified adult male, psychogenic regression. No visitors ever came. But one intern, reviewing old intake notes, scribbled a line in the margins that never made it into the official record. It said, "He walks like the floor, still decides if he's allowed to stand." He had no name. But he carried the silence of a place built to erase identity long before the body finished growing. He didn't speak because someone taught him breath was not his to use. By 1935, the name Sewell no longer appeared in county records. No birth certificates, no marriage filings, no legal heirs. The estate, once sprawling with legal footnotes and inventory lists, fell into silence on the page. The local census taker, Henry Fenn, made a final attempt to record occupants that spring. He approached the gates with blank forms and a sense of duty. What he found was a structure overrun with ivy and wind, its windows covered from the inside with paper so thick it looked like bark. He knocked for 15 minutes and received no answer. But through a crack in the front gate he could see movement, slow, circular, like someone walking in rehearsed loops. He never returned. His entry for the property was written in pencil, not ink. It read, "One male, approximate age unknown, no speech, not confirmed." 3 weeks later, that line was struck through in red. Above it, a note was added in unfamiliar handwriting. "Vacant. Removed from route, Henry Fenn died in a house fire 6 months later." The official ruling was accidental. His logbook was never recovered. Despite the paperwork's erasure, the ground told another story. Behind the estate, near the overgrown edge of the eastern field, were 12 grave markers that hadn't been there in previous decades. All were made of the same clay, crudely molded and fired without glaze, each one bearing a single name, first name only, and a number. The oldest was marked Mira, 3. The most recent, Samuel, 12. None of the names appeared in any death registry. No local priest claimed to have buried them, and none of the town's residents recognized the names as their own. One historian drawn to the site after finding Lionel's initials in an old architectural catalog recorded the layout of the graves. They weren't arranged in rows, but in a spiral, curling inward like a coil. At the center of the spiral, beneath a layer of moss and stones, was a 13th marker. It had no name, only a carved circle with a line drawn through it, center, a census symbol for absent. When excavation was attempted in the 1960s, the soil resisted, not hardened but layered with material that jammed machinery. Woven fabric, small teeth, fragments of porcelain dolls. It was not soil meant to grow crops. It was built to bury memory. The town council, embarrassed by rising interest, fenced off the estate and claimed historical preservation. But behind that wire, the house stood untouched and its paperwork dissolved from every file drawer it once lived in. The Sewells were no longer forgotten because they died. They were forgotten because someone made forgetting a system. Erasure wasn't an accident. It was taught. Passed down like property. Taught to the hands that filled out census pages, taught to the mouths that signed away custody, taught to the bodies that were never supposed to need names again. In 1952, during a routine audit of inactive federal property files, a mislabeled box surfaced in a storage facility beneath the old courthouse archives in Richmond. It bore no agency seal, only the words, "Silent Heir, Restricted," stamped in faded red ink. Inside was a stack of brittle folders held together by copper clasps, each stamped with dates ranging from 1911 to 1939. The contents were not financial, nor criminal. They were anatomical. Pages of medical assessments, photographs mounted on yellowed cardstock. Diagrams of vocal structures cut away at the root. There were no names, only numbers. And in every image the same horror repeated, children seated or strapped to upright boards, mouths slightly open, tongues visibly absent. One envelope contained 12 signed judicial gag orders, each issued by a different county judge between 1914 and 1933. Each one referenced cases involving nonverbal minors placed into isolated institutional study. Each clause prohibited public inquiry, sealed family correspondence, and dismissed adoption claims. The judge's signatures were clean, deliberate. The documents were real. But none of the judges were still alive when the box was discovered, and none of the courts claimed responsibility. Another folder bore the seal of the Department of Social Order, an agency that had no official founding charter. It referenced a location designated Subject Site 09, Rural Training Compound, Confidential Partnership with Sewell Estate. Scrawled in the margin, in an unfamiliar hand, was a note. Compliance through anatomical edit. Irreversible? Inheritable? Monitor progeny. Within 6 months of the file's rediscovery, a quiet demolition crew was dispatched to the Sewell estate. No public record was made. No photographs taken. By late autumn of 1954, the house, its foundations, and all peripheral buildings had been flattened and covered with topsoil. The excuse was structural instability, but satellite records show that the land was resurveyed 3 separate times, each with boundary changes that shrank the property inward, toward its spiral grave pattern. What grows there now is wildflower, thick, untended, unnaturally ordered. In spring, the blooms arrive in perfect rings. Tourists photograph the field but never stay long. Locals report that when the wind rises at dusk, a low tone hums beneath the soil. Not like music, more like the drawn-out hush of a voice never allowed to begin. None of the Silent Heir files were ever made public. Most vanished from internal archives within a year. The clerk who first opened the box resigned 2 days later and left the state. His resignation note was only 5 words. The mouths were still open. The legacy of the Sewell estate cannot be found in law or history books. It does not rest in named graves or remembered family trees. It lives in systems that know how to disappear children on paper, how to harvest obedience from the softest parts of the body, how to grind silence into something generational. The estate is gone, but its lessons remain, buried in air, taught in blueprints, protected by forms that no one remembers signing. And every spring, when the wind moves just right across the field, it still whispers, not words, but the shape of what could never be spoken.